The lights of the small-town theater glowed softly in the evening fog, casting a warm aura over the gathered crowd. Inside, the space buzzed with excitement. Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director, had come to speak about his career, his life, and the lessons he'd learned along the way. Among the attendees was 8-year-old Jacob, sitting quietly next to his grandmother. His father, a devoted Clint Eastwood fan, had passed away 6 months earlier. Jacob clutched a notebook filled with scribbles of questions he wanted to ask. Most of them were about Eastwood's movies, but one, scrawled at the bottom of the page, carried the weight of his grief. Do you believe in God? And why does he let bad things happen to good people? As the evening began, Eastwood stepped onto the stage to applause. His tall, weathered frame and commanding presence filled the room. He spoke about his early days in Hollywood, the challenges he'd faced, and the wisdom he'd gained over decades of storytelling. The audience was enthralled. When the Q&A session began, hands shot up eagerly. Jacob hesitated but finally raised his own, his heart pounding. A microphone was passed to him, and Clint gestured for him to speak. "What's your question, son?" Eastwood asked, his voice gravelly yet kind. Jacob's voice wavered. "Do you believe in God, and why does he let bad things happen to good people?" The theater went silent. Clint Eastwood paused, his sharp blue eyes narrowing slightly as he leaned forward. The weight of the boy's question seemed to settle over the room like a heavy blanket. For a moment, the man who had faced down outlaws and carried countless characters through hardship on screen was stripped of his rehearsed charm. This wasn't a question about movies or fame, it was about life, loss, and faith. He looked at Jacob, seeing not just a boy, but someone who had clearly carried more pain than a child should. Eastwood slowly stood, his hands resting on the edge of the podium as he began to speak. "Well, kid," he started, his voice low and deliberate, "I've spent my whole life trying to make sense of things like that. And if I'm being honest with you, I don't have all the answers." The audience remained completely silent, hanging on to his every word. "When I was young, I lost people I loved too," he continued. "It made me angry. It made me question a lot of things, including God. I used to ask, why them? Why not someone else? But what I've learned over the years is that some questions don't have easy answers. Maybe they aren't supposed to." Jacob's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't look away. Eastwood's voice softened. "What's your name, son?" "Jacob," the boy whispered. Clint nodded. "Jacob, I don't know why bad things happen to good people, but I do know this. When we lose someone we love, they don't really leave us. Your dad's love, his strength, everything he taught you, that's still inside you. You carry it forward. You carry him forward." Jacob's grandmother placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her own eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, though the microphone didn't catch her words. Clint stepped off the stage, walking down toward Jacob. The crowd parted instinctively, all eyes on the moment unfolding before them. Eastwood knelt in front of the boy, meeting him eye to eye. "I'm sorry for your loss, Jacob," he said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "But you're stronger than you know. And I bet your dad would be really proud of you right now." Jacob sniffled, wiping his eyes. "He loved your movies," he said softly. "We used to watch them together." Clint smiled faintly. "Then he must have had great taste." The audience chuckled lightly, breaking the tension in the room just enough to remind everyone to breathe. As Clint returned to the stage, he addressed the crowd again. "You know, life isn't about knowing all the answers. It's about getting through the hard times together. This kid here, he's got more courage than most people I've met. And maybe that's what faith really is, facing the questions we can't answer and still moving forward." The room erupted in applause, not just for Eastwood, but for Jacob, whose bravery had touched everyone in the theater. As the applause faded, Jacob sat down, his grandmother wrapping her arm around him. The moment lingered in the air, and Clint Eastwood stood at the podium again, visibly affected. For a man who had played countless roles of strength and resilience, this was something different, real, raw, and deeply human. He scanned the audience before speaking. "Let me tell you all something," he began, his voice steady but quieter now. "I've spent my life playing tough guys, but the truth is, being tough doesn't mean you don't feel. It doesn't mean you don't hurt. Losing someone you love, it leaves a hole nothing can quite fill. But I've found that sharing those stories, those feelings, brings us closer together. It's what reminds us that we're not alone. A woman in the audience raised her hand. Clint gestured for her to speak. I lost my husband 2 years ago, she said, her voice trembling. Hearing you talk about this, it helps. It reminds me that the pain doesn't have to isolate us. Thank you. Her words seemed to ripple through the room, encouraging others to share. An older man stood up next, removing his cap as he spoke. Lost my son in the war. I've been angry at God ever since, but maybe I've been looking at it all wrong. Clint nodded solemnly. Anger's normal, so is grief. But it's what we do with it that defines us. Maybe the answer isn't about understanding why, but about honoring the people we've lost by how we live. As the conversation unfolded, the theater transformed from a simple Q&A into a shared space of healing. People began opening up about their losses, their faith, and their struggles. A young man in the back spoke about losing his best friend in a car accident. A mother shared how her faith had been tested when her daughter fell ill. Through it all, Clint listened, offering words of comfort and encouragement. But he wasn't the only one. The audience began supporting one another, with strangers offering kind words, nodding in solidarity, or reaching out to hold hands. Jacob, watching all of this, felt something shift inside him. For the first time since his father's death, he didn't feel so alone. He looked up at his grandmother, who smiled through her tears. Your dad would be so proud of you, Jacob, she said softly. After nearly an hour of heartfelt exchanges, Clint brought the discussion to a close. Tonight wasn't what I expected, he said, a faint smile on his face. But maybe that's the point. Sometimes life surprises us in the best ways. Thank you all for sharing your stories. And thank you, Jacob, for asking the question that brought us all together. As people began to leave, many approached Jacob to thank him personally. Some shared their own stories of loss, while others simply offered kind words or a hug. Jacob felt overwhelmed but also comforted, realizing that his pain had connected with so many others. As the theater began to empty, Clint Eastwood remained seated on the edge of the stage. His usual commanding presence seemed softer now, more approachable. He watched as people lingered, talking quietly, exchanging embraces and wiping tears. Jacob stayed seated with his grandmother, clutching the notebook he had brought. When most of the crowd had left, Clint walked down toward Jacob again. The boy looked up at him, his eyes still red from crying. You did something brave tonight, Jacob, Clint said, his voice low but kind. Asking that question, sharing your feelings, it helped a lot of people. Jacob nodded. I miss him, my dad. He always said you were the toughest guy in the movies. I thought maybe you'd have the answers. Clint knelt down, placing a hand on Jacob's shoulder. Well, your dad wasn't wrong about me playing tough guys, he said with a small smile. But I'll tell you a secret. Being tough doesn't mean you have all the answers. It just means you keep going even when it's hard. Jacob looked down at the floor. Do you think he's still watching me? My dad? Clint's expression softened even more. I don't just think it, Jacob. I believe it. And I think he's proud of you for standing up tonight, for being honest about how you feel. That takes more courage than most people realize. Jacob nodded again, his grip tightening on the notebook. Thank you, Mr. Eastwood, Clint smiled. Call me Clint. The boy's grandmother stood then, extending a hand to Clint. Thank you for speaking with him, she said. It's been a hard time for us, but tonight felt like a turning point. Clint shook her hand, his grip firm but gentle. Sometimes all it takes is one moment to remind us we're not alone. As Jacob and his grandmother left the theater, Clint watched them go, feeling a deep sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. He had always valued storytelling, but tonight had shown him the power of listening and connecting on a personal level. The next day, news of the event began to spread. A journalist in attendance had written an article titled, Clint Eastwood and the Boy Who Asked About God. It quickly went viral, sparking conversations around grief, faith, and the importance of community. Jacob's story touched people across the country. Letters and messages poured in from strangers who shared their own experiences with loss and how they had found strength in unlikely places. For Jacob, life didn't magically become easier, but something had changed. He started keeping a journal, writing down his thoughts and memories of his dad. At school, he opened up to his friends for the first time about his loss. Slowly, the heaviness in his heart began to lift, replaced by a sense of connection and hope. Clint, too, felt the impact of that night. In interviews, he spoke not about movies but about Jacob's question and how it reminded him of the things that truly matter. He donated a portion of his earnings from his latest project to grief support organizations, wanting to honor the courage he had seen in the boy. Years later, Jacob would look back on that night as a pivotal moment in his life. He carried Clint's words with him, using them as a guide to navigate the challenges he faced. And Clint, long after the applause had faded, would remember the boy who reminded him that even the toughest questions can bring people together, and that sometimes the greatest strength lies in simply asking them.